Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden in the darkness? Join me on a journey into the unknown, where eerie mysteries and chilling encounters await. Story 1. The Vanished Trail. This story is about a mysterious disappearance that occurred in a remote national park. A young couple ventured into the woods for a weekend camping trip and was never seen again. When rescuers searched the area, they found their campsite undisturbed, their belongings left behind as if they had simply walked away. As the investigation unfolds, strange details emerge, stories of eerie sounds and inexplicable phenomena that have haunted the area for years. What began as a search and rescue mission quickly turns into a terrifying exploration of the unknown. I had heard about the disappearances before I took the job. My friends warned me, jokingly at first, but then more seriously when they saw I was determined to go. It was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, working as a seasonal park ranger in one of the most beautiful, albeit remote, national parks in the country. The pay was decent, the solitude was appealing, and the chance to spend my days in nature was a dream come true. The rumors of people vanishing on the trails had circulated for years, whispered around campfires and shared in low voices by those who had been in the park long enough to see strange things. Most of the stories were dismissed as urban legends, tales exaggerated by time and retellings, but there was one story that stuck with me. A young couple, Anna and Jason, who had disappeared without a trace just 2 years before I arrived. It was late spring when Anna and Jason planned their trip. They were both avid hikers, experienced in the outdoors, and eager to explore the less traveled paths of the park. They arrived at the ranger station early in the morning, checked in with the staff, and set off down one of the more challenging trails. They had a detailed map, enough supplies for several days, and their spirits were high. The weather was perfect, the sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. When they didn't return on the expected day, their families grew worried. Calls were made, and a search was quickly organized. The park's rescue team was dispatched, scouring the trails and surrounding areas. They found Anna and Jason's car, still parked at the trailhead, untouched. They followed the couple's intended route, tracing their steps deep into the forest. The trail was well marked with signs indicating the way at regular intervals. There were no signs of a struggle, no indications that they had strayed from the path. Eventually, the search team reached a small clearing where Anna and Jason had set up their camp. Their tent was still standing, the entrance flap open as if they had just stepped out for a moment. Inside, their sleeping bags were neatly laid out, their backpacks were zipped and full of supplies, and their cooking gear was arranged by the fire pit. Nothing was out of place, except for the eerie fact that they were nowhere to be found. The ground around the campsite was soft, covered in a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles. The searchers found footprints, 2 sets leading into the clearing from the trail, and then nothing. The footprints simply ended, as if Anna and Jason had vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, more search teams were brought in, including dogs and helicopters. The forest was combed meticulously, every inch of ground searched for clues, but there was nothing. No signs of an animal attack, no blood, no discarded items. The forest was silent, the only sounds those of nature, unperturbed by human presence. As the days turned into weeks, hope faded. The search was eventually called off, and the case was classified as an unsolved disappearance. It wasn't the first in the park's history, but it was the most unsettling. The lack of any evidence, the complete and utter absence of the couple, haunted those who had been involved in the search. When I took the job, I was determined to find out more about what had happened. I wasn't a detective, but I had a strong sense of curiosity and a desire to understand the truth. I spent my off hours talking to the older rangers, those who had been around when Anna and Jason disappeared. Most of them were tight-lipped, unwilling to speculate. But there was one ranger, Hank, who seemed willing to share more than the others. Hank was in his 60s, a grizzled veteran of the Park Service. He had seen it all: accidents, injuries, animal attacks. But when he talked about the disappearances, a shadow crossed his face. He wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural, but there was something about this particular case that had shaken him. They weren't the first to go missing. He told me one evening, as we sat on the porch of the ranger station, watching the sun dip below the horizon. But they were the first where we didn't find anything. Not a single clue. I asked him if he had any theories. He shrugged, taking a long drag on his cigarette before responding. There are stories, he said finally. Old stories passed down from the indigenous people who lived here long before the park was established. They talk about spirits in the woods, entities that can take people, pull them into another realm. It sounds like nonsense, I know. But when you've been out here as long as I have, you start to wonder. I wasn't sure what to make of his words. I had always been a skeptic, someone who needed hard evidence to believe in something. But the more I learned about Anna and Jason's disappearance, the more unsettled I became. It was early one morning, about a month into my job, when I decided to visit the site where they had last been seen. I packed a small bag with some water, snacks, and a first aid kit and set off down the trail. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray, and the forest seemed quieter than usual. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though every time I turned around there was nothing but trees and underbrush. The trail was well maintained, but it still felt remote, isolated from the rest of the world. I reached the clearing where Anna and Jason had set up their camp just before noon. The area was exactly as I had imagined it, a small, flat space surrounded by tall pines, with the remains of a fire pit in the center. I stood there for a long time, trying to picture what might have happened. I walked around the site, examining the ground, looking for anything that might have been missed in the initial search. There was nothing unusual, nothing out of place, but as I stood near the fire pit, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint, distant sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was just the wind, a trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. I decided to head back to the station, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. An old, weathered trail marker, half hidden by moss and undergrowth. It pointed deeper into the forest, away from the main trail. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, wondering if this was where Anna and Jason had gone. The official reports had said nothing about a secondary trail, but there it was, clear as day. In this my better judgment, I started down the path. It was narrow, overgrown, and clearly hadn't been used in years. The further I went, the darker it became, as the trees closed in overhead, blocking out the light. The air grew cooler, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the damp earth. I don't know how long I walked before I heard it again. That same faint whisper, but this time it was closer, more distinct. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped as soon as it began. My pulse quickened, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I knew I should turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwined like a canopy overhead. I stumbled once or twice on roots that seemed to reach out and grab at my feet, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the trail ended. I found myself in a small, circular clearing. In the center stood a large, flat stone, weathered and covered in ancient carvings that I couldn't quite make out. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness about I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the stone, before I heard it. A low, rumbling growl coming from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. My heart leaped into my throat, and I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel something watching me, something that I couldn't see but knew was there. I finally managed to break free from the invisible grip and bolted back the way I came, not daring to look back. The return journey was a blur. I ran until my lungs burned, driven by pure fear. When I finally burst out onto the main trail, the sunlight felt blinding, the air fresh and warm. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, where I collapsed, gasping for breath. I never told anyone about what I had found or what had happened in that clearing. I couldn't explain it, and I knew no one would believe me. But after that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent lurked in those woods. Something that had taken Anna and Jason, and that had almost taken me as well. The disappearances never stopped. Every few years, someone else would vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and empty spaces where their footprints should have been. I stayed on the job for a few more months, but the forest never felt the same. The beauty that had once drawn me there now seemed like a mask, hiding something dark and unfathomable. Eventually, I left the park and moved far away, to a place where the trees were sparse and the land was flat. But I still dream about that trail sometimes, and when I wake up, I can still hear the whispering in my ears, calling me back to the place where the path ends and the unknown begins. After that day, the forest never felt the same to me. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a chill down my spine. I tried to push the experience out of my mind, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew that what I had encountered in the woods was real, something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the edges of our understanding. I continued my work as a ranger, but I avoided the area where I had found that hidden trail. I stuck to the more populated parts of the park, where the sounds of other people and the occasional passing car provided a sense of normalcy. But the unease never left me. It followed me like a shadow, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected. One evening, about a month after my encounter, I was called to the ranger station for a meeting. It was unusual. Meetings were rare, and when they did happen, they were usually scheduled well in advance. But this one was called suddenly, with no explanation. I arrived at the station to find a few of the other rangers already there, their faces grim. Hank was among them, sitting in the corner, staring out the window with a troubled expression. The head ranger, a man named Tom, entered the room and closed the door behind him. He looked around at us, his face serious. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice low. "A family has reported 2 more hikers missing. They were last seen on the same trail where Anna and Jason disappeared." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I didn't need to ask which trail he meant. I knew it all too well. Tom continued. "We're organizing a search party. I need volunteers to go out there tonight." The room was silent. The other rangers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that everyone shared. No one wanted to go back to that trail, especially not at night. But I knew I couldn't let this go. I had to know what was happening in those woods, even if it terrified me. I raised my hand. "I'll go," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Tom nodded, his expression unreadable. "All right, Hank, you go with him." Hank looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sympathy, maybe a regret. He nodded slowly. The rest of the rangers breathed a collective sigh of relief, clearly glad they weren't the ones who had to go. Tom gave us the details. 2 hikers, a brother and sister in their early 20s, had been missing for over 24 hours. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, and they hadn't checked in with any of the ranger stations. We were to head out immediately, search the area, and report back by morning. We gathered our gear in silence. I could feel the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me, but there was no turning back now. As we left the station, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The drive to the trailhead was tense. Hank and I didn't speak, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The road wound through the forest, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. By the time we arrived, the last light of day had faded, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. We stepped out of the truck, the air cool and still. The trailhead was deserted, the only sign of life the distant hoot of an owl. Hank turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. I did the same, and together we began our journey down the trail. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals strangely absent. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the path ahead, but the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, as if the trees themselves were closing in around us. I kept my eyes on the ground, scanning for any signs of the missing hikers, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to indicate that anyone had passed this way. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees and the occasional flicker of movement as a branch swayed in the breeze. We reached the clearing where Anna and Jason had camped, and I felt a surge of dread. The campsite looked just as it had the last time I was here, undisturbed, as if the missing couple might step out from behind the trees at any moment. But of course they didn't. Hank and I spread out, searching the area with our flashlights. We looked for anything: footprints, torn clothing, a trail of breadcrumbs, anything that might give us a clue. But the clearing was as empty as before, and the oppressive silence weighed heavily on us. "Over here," Hank called, his voice tight. I hurried over to where he was standing, his flashlight beam focused on something on the ground. It was a trail marker, the same one I had seen before, half hidden by moss and undergrowth. It pointed deeper into the forest, down that same forgotten path. Hank looked at me, his expression grim. "We need to check it out." I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But we had a job to do and 2 lives potentially at stake. We stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow, overgrown path. The darkness seemed to deepen as we moved forward, the trees closing in around us like a living wall. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being swallowed by the forest. The air grew colder, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. Walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. The trail twisted and turned, leading us further into the heart of the forest. I kept expecting to hear that whisper again, the one that had haunted me since my last visit, but the air was deathly silent. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the same small clearing I had found before. The stone was still there, looming in the center like some ancient altar, its surface etched with strange, unreadable symbols. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence that made my skin crawl. Hank approached the stone, his flashlight playing over its surface. I hung back, my instincts screaming that we were in grave danger. As he got closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. An object half buried in the dirt near the base of the stone. "Hank, wait." I called out, but he didn't stop. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his hand, revealing what looked like a small, leather-bound book. I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder as he opened the book. The pages were old, brittle, and covered in strange symbols and drawings. Some of them looked like maps, others like rituals. But what caught my eye was a series of sketches, crude but unmistakable. They depicted people, standing in a circle around the stone, their faces twisted in fear. "What the hell is this?" Hank muttered, flipping through the pages.
I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The book looked ancient, and the drawings suggested something dark, something that had been practiced here long ago. But what was it doing here? And how was it connected to the disappearances?
Before I could voice my thoughts, a low rumbling sound filled the air. It was the same growl I had heard before, but this time it was closer, louder, and filled with a malevolent intent. Hank and I both froze, our flashlights flickering as if the batteries were dying. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the clearing, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground beneath us was holding us in place, preventing our escape. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing as something moved within them. I could feel it watching us, a presence that was far older and far more dangerous than anything I had ever encountered. "Run," Hank shouted, finally breaking free of whatever force had been holding him in place. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, my flashlight swinging wildly as I tore through the underbrush, Hank right behind me. The growling followed us, growing louder, more menacing, as if whatever was in the clearing was giving chase. We ran without looking back, our only goal to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. The trail was nearly impossible to see, and I stumbled more than once, my feet catching on roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. Not until we burst out onto the main trail. Gasping for breath, the forest was still dark, but the menacing presence was gone. The air was lighter, the oppressive feeling lifted. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the truck, both of us too shaken to process what had just happened. When we finally reached the ranger station, it was nearly dawn. Tom was waiting for us, his expression concerned. "Did you find them?" he asked. We shook our heads, unable to explain what we had seen, what we had felt. How could we? It sounded insane, like something out of a nightmare, but it was real and it was something we couldn't ignore. Tom didn't press us for details, but I could see in his eyes that he knew something was wrong, something beyond what any of us could understand. The official report we filed said nothing about the growling, the stone, or the book. It simply stated that we had searched the area and found no trace of the missing hikers, but the truth was something far darker, something that I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Hank and I both left the Park Service not long after that. We didn't talk about what had happened and we never kept in touch, but I knew that the same nightmares haunted him, just as they did me. The disappearances continued. Every few years someone else would vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but empty tents, forgotten belongings, and the haunting question of what had happened to them. I've tried to forget, to move on with my life, but the memories won't let me. The forest calls to me in my dreams, beckoning me back to that place where the path ends and the unknown begins. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispering in my ears, a voice from the darkness, calling me back to the vanished trail where all things are lost and nothing is ever truly gone. Story 2. It's the mystery of the disappearance on the old road. In 1987, a bus full of passengers vanished without a trace on an old, desolate road outside the city. The authorities searched tirelessly but found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, just an empty stretch of cracked asphalt swallowed by the surrounding forest. The case quickly became a local legend, whispered about in hushed tones. But with no evidence, it was eventually forgotten, buried under the weight of time. Decades later, a driver traveling the same road late at night reported seeing the faint glow of headlights in his rearview mirror, only for them to disappear as suddenly as they had appeared. He also claimed to have heard unsettling, distant cries that seemed to echo through the night air. His account sparked renewed interest in the case, and as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered terrifying connections to ancient folklore that spoke of cursed lands and the spirits of the lost. This story is about that road, about the dark secrets it holds, and about the inexplicable events that continue to haunt those who dare to travel it. The truth, as you'll soon discover, is far more chilling than any legend. The old road had always been a place people avoided, especially at night. It cut through a stretch of dense, foreboding forest that seemed to swallow the light whole, leaving only darkness behind. The trees, tall and ancient, lined the road like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining above to create a tunnel of shadows. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Even in broad daylight, it had an otherworldly quality to it, as if it existed just slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. In 1987, a bus had taken this road, Route 9 as it was officially known, on a foggy autumn evening. The bus was full, mostly locals returning from the city after a long day. The driver, a seasoned professional named Paul, knew the route well. He'd driven it hundreds of times before, navigating its twists and turns with the ease of someone who could do it with his eyes closed. But that night, something was different. The fog was thicker than usual, and an uneasy silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The bus never reached its destination. When it failed to arrive, a search was quickly organized. Dozens of officers, volunteers, and even helicopters scoured the road and the surrounding forest for any sign of the missing vehicle. They found nothing. No skid marks, no signs of a crash, just an empty road that seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the mist. The passengers, too, were never seen again. It was as if the bus had simply vanished off the face of the earth. In the years that followed, the disappearance became the stuff of urban legend. People whispered about the phantom bus that had been swallowed by the road, speculated about portals to other dimensions, or cursed lands where the spirits of the dead roamed free. But for the families of the lost, it was no ghost story. It was a living nightmare. They held out hope for years, but with no answers. Most eventually resigned themselves to the idea that they would never know what had happened. That was until one cold winter night in 2024, when a lone driver named Eric found himself on that very same road. Eric was a man in his late 40s, a truck driver by trade, who had spent most of his life on the road. He was not one to scare easily. He had driven through blizzards, tornadoes, and all manner of inclement weather without batting an eye. But there was something about Route 9 that had always unsettled him. He usually avoided it, taking a longer route to bypass the eerie stretch of road. But that night, pressed for time, he had little choice but to take it. The fog that night was thick, clinging to the trees and the road like a living thing. His headlights barely penetrated it, illuminating only a few feet ahead before being swallowed by the mist. The radio crackled with static, and despite fiddling with the dial, Eric couldn't find a clear signal. The silence in the cab was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of the tires on the wet pavement. As he drove, he noticed something strange. In his rearview mirror, he could see headlights, distant at first, then growing brighter, as if a vehicle was approaching from behind. But when he glanced out of the side mirror, the road was empty. He checked the mirror again, and the lights were still there, growing closer. He could even make out the faint shape of a vehicle, though it was distorted, as if viewed through a haze. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He sped up, trying to put some distance between himself and whatever was behind him, but the lights kept pace, hovering in his mirror like some spectral apparition. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The road behind him was empty, shrouded in fog, and silence once again reigned in the cab. Shaken, Eric tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself, the fog playing tricks on his eyes. But then he heard it, a faint sound barely audible over the hum of the engine. It was a cry, distant and muffled, but unmistakable. A cry of fear, of panic, and then another and another until the air was filled with the sound of voices, all crying out in terror. Eric slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt. The cries continued, seeming to come from all around him, echoing through the trees and the fog. He rolled down the window, straining to see or hear something. Anything that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the fog and the darkness, and those terrible disembodied voices. He threw the truck into gear and sped off, the cries fading into the distance as he tore down the road. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, where he pulled into a gas station and sat in the cab, trying to calm his nerves. He told himself it was just his imagination, that the stress of the job in the late hour had gotten to him. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. He had heard those voices, had seen those lights, and he wasn't the only one. When he finally made it home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He did some research, digging into the history of Route 9, and that's when he stumbled upon the story of the missing bus. The more he read, the more convinced he became that what he had experienced was connected to that disappearance all those years ago. Eric reached out to the authorities, telling them what he had seen and heard. At first, they were skeptical, dismissing his account as a hallucination or a dream. But his story was eerily similar to other reports they had received over the years. Reports that had been quietly filed away and forgotten. A new investigation was opened, and what they found was more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. Buried deep in the archives were old documents, records of strange occurrences along Route 9 dating back centuries. There were reports of phantom carriages, ghostly apparitions, and mysterious lights that led travelers astray. And then there were the legends. Stories passed down through generations about a cursed road where the spirits of the lost wandered, unable to find their way home. As they dug deeper, They discovered that the land the road had been built on was once considered sacred by the indigenous people of the area. It was said to be a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, where the spirits of the departed could cross over into the world of the living. Those who ventured onto the land risked becoming trapped between worlds, lost forever. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the disappearance of the bus was not an isolated incident, but part of something much larger, something ancient and malevolent. The road was a gateway, a place where the dead and the living could meet, but at a terrible cost. Eric's account was the final piece of the puzzle, the spark that reignited the investigation. But as they delved deeper into the mystery, those involved began to experience strange phenomena. Lights flickering, voices whispering in the night, and the feeling of being watched. Some even reported seeing the ghostly outline of a bus on the road, filled with shadowy figures, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The case remains unsolved, the truth buried beneath layers of folklore and fear. But one thing is certain, Route 9 is no ordinary road, and those who travel it do so at their own risk. And for Eric, the memories of that night haunt him still. He avoids the road at all costs, but sometimes, late at night, he can still hear the cries, echoing in his mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurks on that old, forgotten road. Eric tried to put the experience behind him, but the haunting memories never truly left him. He avoided Route 9 whenever possible, but the echoes of that night crept into his thoughts, resurfacing at the most unexpected moments. Despite his efforts to ignore it, the mystery of the vanished bus gnawed at him, drawing him back to the old road like a moth to a flame. One chilly autumn evening, a few months after the investigation had been reopened, Eric found himself unable to sleep. The persistent whispers in his mind, the recollection of the ghostly headlights, and the disembodied cries plagued his thoughts. With a mix of apprehension and curiosity, he decided to return to the scene, hoping to confront his fears and perhaps uncover more answers. As he drove towards Route 9, the fog rolled in, thick and heavy, much like it had been on the night of his unsettling encounter. The air was cold and damp, and the road seemed even more foreboding under the shroud of darkness. Eric's headlights cut through the fog, creating eerie patterns on the pavement as he made his way along the twisted route. He parked his truck at the same spot where he had experienced the inexplicable cries and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Eric stepped out of the truck, the chill of the night biting at his skin. He approached the edge of the road, where the trees seemed to loom even larger in the darkness. With each step he took, the silence grew heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Eric tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, the sense of unseen eyes following his every move. He set up a small camera on a tripod, hoping to capture any anomalies that might occur. As he did so, he felt a growing sense of unease, a gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sound swirled around him, and the temperature seemed to drop further. Eric glanced at the camera, which was recording the scene in the darkness. He could barely make out the shapes of the trees and the road ahead. He took a deep breath and began to walk along the old road, his footsteps muffled by the thick fog. He had walked only a short distance when he noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible glow emanating from the woods to his right. He paused, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out what it could be. The glow was faint, like the distant light of a car headlamp, but it was moving, shifting as if it was being carried by someone or something. Eric's heart raced. He followed the light, stepping cautiously through the underbrush. The fog seemed to thicken, and the glow grew brighter, revealing itself to be a pair of ghostly headlights, hovering just above the ground. The headlights moved erratically, darting back and forth as if searching for something. He reached for his phone, hoping to capture the phenomenon on video. But as he fumbled with the device, the headlights vanished, leaving him in complete darkness. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Eric's breath came in short, rapid gasps, as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. He turned around and started to head back to his truck, but then he heard it again. The distant cries, They were louder now, more distinct, filled with desperation and terror. The cries seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the fog and the trees. Panicking, Eric stumbled back to his truck, his mind racing with fear. He fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and climb inside. He started the engine, the roar of the truck's motor cutting through the eerie silence. As he pulled away from the roadside, he glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything. Behind him, what he saw made his blood run cold. The road was empty, but in the distance, he could make out the ghostly outline of a bus, its headlights flickering in and out of view. The bus appeared to be floating above the ground, its form distorted and ethereal. It moved slowly, as if trapped between worlds, and its passengers were shadowy figures, their faces hidden in darkness. Eric drove faster, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The cries grew louder, almost deafening, and he could feel a chill spreading through the truck's cab. The ghostly bus seemed to follow him, its headlights casting an unsettling glow on the road behind him. When he finally reached the safety of the town, he was trembling, his mind reeling from the night's events. He couldn't shake the image of the ghostly bus and the cries of the lost passengers. The encounter left him with more questions than answers, and he knew he couldn't keep the experience to himself. Eric shared his story with the local authorities and the media, recounting every detail of what he had witnessed. The renewed interest in the case led to further investigations, but the eerie phenomena on Route 9 remained elusive. There were reports of other drivers experiencing similar ghostly encounters, but no concrete evidence. The investigation revealed more about the ancient legends associated with the road. Stories told of an old curse placed upon the land by indigenous people, a curse that trapped the souls of the lost in a perpetual limbo. The legend spoke of travelers who would find themselves lost on the road, forever unable to escape the supernatural forces that dwelled there. In the case of the vanished bus, and the haunting encounters on Route 9 became a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface of the everyday world. For Eric, the experience was a haunting reminder of the dark and unexplained forces that lurked just out of sight, waiting to draw the unwary into their grasp. As the years passed, the story of the phantom bus and the haunted road became a local legend, a chilling tale to be told around campfires and whispered in the dark. But for those who had experienced it firsthand, the mystery of Route 9 remained a haunting enigma, a reminder that some roads are best left unexplored, and some stories are better left untold. The months following Eric's terrifying encounter on Route 9 saw a flurry of activity. The media had caught wind of the ghostly phenomena, and soon the old road became a hotspot for paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and curious onlookers. But as the excitement grew, so did the sense of dread. Reports of strange occurrences continued to surface, but the darkness of Route 9 remained inscrutable. Despite the increased attention, the authorities struggled to make sense of the supernatural claims. Attempts to capture evidence of the ghostly bus or the cries of the lost passengers proved futile. The road, cloaked in its thick fog, seemed impervious to their efforts. The phenomenon appeared to elude capture, almost as if it thrived on the fear and uncertainty it inspired. Eric, now a reluctant celebrity in the world of the paranormal, found himself drawn back to the old road. The images of the ghostly bus and the cries never left his mind, and he was compelled to understand the truth behind these haunting events. His curiosity outweighed his fear, pushing him to delve deeper into the mysteries that had unsettled him so profoundly. One brisk autumn evening, he decided to visit Route 9 once more. Armed with more advanced recording equipment and a newfound determination, Eric drove the road with a sense of purpose. The fog was thick, enveloping the landscape in an almost tangible darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the trees loomed like specters in the mist. As he approached the area where he had seen the ghostly headlights, Eric set up his equipment. He placed several cameras along the roadside and set up motion sensors to detect any unusual activity. His heart raced with anticipation, knowing that this might be his last chance to uncover the truth. He took a deep breath and started walking along the road, the fog swirling around him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches and the distant call of an owl. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, an almost palpable presence that seemed to follow his every step. Eric reached the spot where he had seen the headlights before, and as he stood there, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. The fog grew denser, swirling around him in strange patterns. He could barely see a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to close in, making it difficult to breathe. Then he heard it, the faint, distant sound of a bus engine. The noise was barely audible, like the hum of a distant vehicle, but it was unmistakable. Eric's heart skipped a beat. He fumbled for his recording equipment, trying to capture the sound before it faded away. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Eric turned in the direction of the noise, his eyes straining to see through the fog. The engine noise was accompanied by the same cries he had heard before, distant but filled with a sense of despair and urgency. He could make out the faint outline of a vehicle in the mist, its headlights flickering like ghostly beacons. The ghostly bus appeared, moving slowly through the fog, its form shimmery and indistinct. The headlights cast an eerie glow on the road, and the figures inside were shadowy and indistinct, their faces obscured by darkness. The bus seemed to float above the ground, its wheels moving without touching the pavement. Eric watched in stunned silence as the ghostly bus drew closer. The cries grew louder, filling the air with a sense of palpable fear. The bus passed by him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The phantom vehicle moved with a mournful grace, as if it was trapped in a state of eternal limbo. He tried to follow the bus, but as he moved, it began to fade into the mist. The cries became more distant, and the headlights grew dimmer. Eric felt a cold, eerie chill as the bus disappeared into the fog, leaving him alone once more, desperate to understand what he had seen. Eric returned to his truck and reviewed the footage from his cameras. The recordings showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the fog and the darkness of the road. There was no evidence of the ghostly bus or the cries, only the unsettling silence that had pervaded the area. Frustrated but determined, Eric decided to visit local historians and experts on the region's folklore. He learned more about the road's dark history, uncovering stories of tragic accidents, mysterious disappearances, and ancient curses. One historian spoke of a local legend involving a group of travelers who had vanished on the road centuries ago, their souls forever trapped in a cycle of torment. The legend told of a powerful curse placed upon the land by an ancient tribe. According to the lore, the tribe had been betrayed by settlers who sought to claim their sacred land. In their final act of defiance, the tribe had cursed the road, vowing that anyone who traveled it would become lost forever, their souls doomed to wander between worlds. Eric's findings connected the dots between the ancient curse and the modern-day phenomena. The ghostly bus and the cries were not just random occurrences, but manifestations of the curse, a dark reminder of the ancient wrongs that had been committed. Despite his discoveries, Eric felt that he had only scratched the surface of the mystery. The road's dark history and the supernatural occurrences remained as elusive as ever, with the truth shrouded in fog and fear. He continued to document his experiences, hoping that someday someone would unravel the full extent of the curse and bring closure to the restless souls trapped on Route 9. The tale of the phantom bus and the haunted road became a chilling legend, a story passed down through generations, a reminder of the darkness that lies just beyond the veil of the known world. And for Eric, the old road remained a haunting reminder of the thin boundary between the living and the dead, a place where the echoes of the past still resonate, forever trapped in the mist. Story 3. The vanished town in the mountains. It's in the shadowed heights of the mountains, where the air grows thin and the cold bites through to the bone. There once lay a small mining town called Ardent Peak. It was a place where coal and silver had drawn fortune seekers and dreamers, and its prosperity was a beacon in the desolate wilderness. However, one chilling night, the town vanished, its residents disappearing without a trace. The sudden emptiness left behind was not only unsettling but filled with chaos and strange symbols. Years later, a group of researchers, driven by curiosity and the lure of mystery, ventured into the abandoned town to uncover the truth behind its disappearance. What they discovered would challenge their sanity and reveal forces best left undisturbed. The first time I heard about Ardent Peak was during a lecture on abandoned places and unsolved mysteries. The professor's description of the town's sudden disappearance sparked my imagination and set my mind racing. The town, perched high in the mountains, had been a hub of activity before its inexplicable vanishing. It was said that, in a single night, all its inhabitants were gone, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. An entire community simply evaporated, leaving their belongings and lives frozen in time. After weeks of deliberation and planning, a group of us, a historian, a geologist, and 2 seasoned explorers, decided to investigate Ardent Peak. Our goal was to understand the inexplicable events that led to the town's sudden abandonment. Armed with our equipment, cameras, and a strong sense of adventure, we set off on our journey, driven by the hope of unraveling one of the mountain's darkest mysteries. The trek to Ardent Peak was arduous. The mountain paths were steep and treacherous, winding through dense forests and rocky outcrops. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder and a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring our view and adding to the sense of isolation. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Each step felt heavier as the weight of the impending darkness pressed down upon us. When we finally reached the town's outskirts, night had fallen, and the fog had thickened, shrouding Ardent Peak in an eerie glow. The town lay in front of us like a ghostly relic from another era. The streets were eerily silent, and the buildings, once lively and full of activity, stood empty and decrepit. The only sounds were the creaking of old wooden structures and the occasional gust of wind rattling through broken windows. The first thing that struck me was the unnatural stillness. There were no animals, no signs of nature reclaiming the space. It was as if the entire town had been frozen in time. We set up our base camp in what appeared to be a former inn, its sign hanging loosely from a rusted chain. Outside, the air was musty and thick with dust. The furnishings were left in disarray, chairs overturned, tables scattered, and personal belongings strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. As we began our investigation, we noticed peculiar markings on the walls and floors. These symbols were etched in a dark, almost oily substance that seemed to glisten faintly in the dim light of our flashlights. They were unlike anything we had ever seen before. Complex, intertwined patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The historian among us speculated that these might be some form of ritualistic symbols. Our exploration led us through various parts of the town, each revealing more of the strange and unsettling atmosphere that pervaded Ardent Peak. The local schoolhouse was one of the most disturbing sights. Desks and chairs were arranged in neat rows, but the blackboard was covered in incomprehensible scribbles, and the textbooks lay open to pages that detailed ominous rituals and symbols. It was as if someone had been in the middle of something profoundly sinister when they vanished. The town's mine was another focal point of our investigation. The entrance was heavily secured with rusted iron bars, but we managed to force our way inside. The mine's tunnels were labyrinthine, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and old machinery. Strange markings were etched into the walls here as well, and in some places we found remnants of old mining equipment left in a state of disrepair. The deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease grew. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, and our flashlights cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. As we delved further into the mine, we stumbled upon a large chamber that appeared to be the heart of the operations. In the center of the room stood a strange altar, surrounded by more of the cryptic symbols we had seen throughout the town. The altar was covered in a layer of dust, but there were signs that something had recently been moved or disturbed. Nearby, we discovered old diaries and letters scattered on the ground. These documents were filled with frantic writings, describing a growing sense of dread among the townspeople and an increasing number of unexplained occurrences. One of the letters detailed a series of strange events leading up to the night of the disappearance. The writer spoke of ominous dreams, unexplained noises, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. The last entry was particularly chilling, describing a ritual that had been performed in a desperate attempt to ward off an impending threat. The words were disjointed and erratic, but they hinted at something far more sinister than mere superstition. As we continued to explore, we began to notice a pattern emerging. The symbols and markings seemed to form a complex web, leading us to believe that whatever had happened in Ardent Peak was not a random event, but the result of a deliberate and possibly malevolent act. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and each creak of the old buildings or shift of the fog outside seemed to heighten our anxiety. The night wore on, and our fatigue began to set in. Despite our efforts to remain vigilant, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in the town. Each shadow seemed to hold a hidden presence, and every gust of wind carried whispers that we couldn't quite make out. The sense of dread was palpable, and we all felt an increasing urgency to uncover the truth before the night was out. In the early hours of the morning, we decided to regroup and review our findings. As we sat around the flickering light of our campfire discussing our observations, a loud noise echoed through the town. A sound like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It was followed by a deep resonant thump that seemed to come from the direction of the mine. The noise was enough to send a chill down our spines, and we knew we had to investigate further. With renewed determination, we prepared to return to the mine. The fog had thickened and the visibility was poor, but we pressed on, driven by the need to uncover the truth behind the town's disappearance. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional distant echo. As we approached the mine entrance, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The markings on the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the atmosphere was charged with an inexplicable tension. We entered the mine once more, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The deeper we went, the more we felt as though we were being drawn into something far beyond our understanding. Finally, we reached the chamber with the altar. To our shock, we found it disturbed. Items that had been in place before were now scattered, and the symbols on the ground had been altered. It was clear that someone or something had been here since our last visit. Our exploration had only just begun to scratch the surface of the mystery that enveloped Ardent Peak. As we prepared to delve further into the mine, the realization of the danger we were in began to sink in. Whatever had caused the town's disappearance was still very much present, and we were about to uncover something that might be better left buried in the shadows of the mountains. The truth about Ardent Peak was waiting for us, hidden in the darkness of the mine and the whispers of the abandoned town. The sense of urgency was palpable, and the chilling reality of our situation began to weigh heavily on us. We were on the brink of uncovering a secret that might be more than we could handle. The unsettling feeling that had been growing since our arrival in Ardent Peak intensified as we re-entered the mine. The air was colder, and the once faint echoes now seemed to carry an ominous weight. In the changes we had observed in the chamber with the altar hinted at a disturbing presence, one that had been waiting for us. Our flashlights pierced through the darkness, revealing the twisted symbols on the walls that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The markings were now more pronounced, their lines growing thicker and more aggressive. The air was charged with an electric tension, and every creak of the old mine amplified our anxiety. As we made our way deeper into the mine, the silence was occasionally broken by the distant drip of water and the whisper of the wind. It felt as though the mine itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The historian, who had been examining the symbols closely, murmured that the markings were not just ritualistic but might be connected to an ancient and dark power. The mine's tunnels twisted and turned in ways that seemed to defy logic. We navigated by marking our path with chalk, but it soon became apparent that our marks were being erased or altered. It was as though the mine was deliberately confusing us, leading us further into its depths. Our once straightforward exploration was becoming a nightmarish labyrinth. The deeper we went, the more the atmosphere grew oppressive. The temperature dropped even further, and we could see our breath condense in the cold air. Strange noises began to emanate from the walls, low guttural growls and whispers that seemed to come from Our nerves were frayed, but we pressed on, driven by the need to understand what had happened in Ardent. After what felt like hours of navigating the twisting tunnels, we stumbled upon a large, cavernous chamber. In the center of the room was an enormous stone altar, covered in symbols similar to those we had seen earlier but far more intricate and elaborate. The altar was surrounded by an array of bizarre artifacts. Old, worn masks, tattered robes, and other ritualistic items that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The air in the chamber was thick and suffocating. We could feel a palpable pressure, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an unseen force. The historian examined the altar and the surrounding symbols, his face pale with realization. He suggested that the artifacts might be remnants of a long-forgotten cult, one that had practiced dark rites and possibly summoned something that could not be controlled. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the chamber, causing us to jump. We turned to see that a section of the wall had collapsed, revealing a hidden passage. The passage was narrow and winding, but our curiosity overpowered our fear. We decided to explore it, hoping it might lead us to answers. The passage led us to a smaller chamber, where we found what appeared to be an old journal, lying on a pedestal. The journal was weathered and ancient, its cover cracked and worn. The pages inside were filled with frantic, scrawled notes. The entries detailed the activities of the town's last days, describing increasing disturbances and the growing influence of a dark presence. The writer spoke of desperate rituals and a final, catastrophic attempt to appease whatever force had taken hold of the town. One entry, in particular, stood out. It described a ritual performed to open a portal or gateway, which the writer believed would allow them to communicate with the entity that had been haunting them. The last entry was incomplete, but it hinted at a grave mistake made during the ritual. A miscalculation that might have unleashed something far worse than intended. As we read the journal, the temperature in the chamber dropped suddenly, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. The lights from our flashlights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and we could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnels, though no one was visible. Panic set in as the hum grew louder and the ground began to tremble. The chamber seemed to distort, its walls pulsating with an unnatural energy. We tried to leave, but the passage we had come through was now blocked by rubble that had mysteriously appeared. It was as if the mine itself was trying to keep us trapped. Desperate, we searched for another way out. The historian's face was a mask of terror as he realized that the entity described in the journal might still be present, its influence affecting the very fabric of the mine. The growling noises we had heard earlier grew louder and more distinct, and we could see faint, ghostly figures moving in the periphery of our vision. We stumbled upon another chamber, this one filled with strange, pulsating lights and shadowy figures. The symbols on the walls glowed with a sickly green hue, and the air was thick with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in strange markings. The reflection in the mirror was not our own, but a distorted, nightmarish version of reality, with dark shapes and malevolent eyes peering out. The historian's voice trembled as he explained that the mirror might be a focal point of the ritual, a gateway to another realm. The journal had hinted at the possibility that the town's residents had been trapped between worlds, their souls bound by the failed ritual. As we tried to make sense of our surroundings, the ground shook violently, and the chamber began to collapse. Dust and debris filled the air, and the once faint growls turned into full-fledged roars. We were trapped, with no clear way out, and the sense of an imminent, overwhelming force closing in on us. In a last-ditch effort, we attempted to dismantle the mirror and destroy the symbols around it. We hoped that by disrupting the focal point of the dark energy, we might be able to escape. The historian and the geologist worked feverishly, while the explorers and I tried to keep the crumbling ceiling at bay. Just as we thought all hope was lost, a blinding flash of light erupted from the mirror, and the ground stopped shaking. The oppressive energy seemed to dissipate, and the strange noises and figures vanished. We were left in an eerie silence, the mine around us now eerily calm. With the danger seemingly past, we made our way back through the collapsed passage and out of the mine. The fog outside had cleared, and the once foreboding town of Ardent Peak was now bathed in the soft light of dawn. The morning sun, though welcome, did little to dispel the feeling of dread that clung to us. We returned to our base camp, exhausted and shaken by our experiences. The journal and artifacts we had recovered were left behind, their significance too great to be fully understood. Ardent Peak had revealed only a fraction of its dark secret, and we had narrowly escaped with our lives. As we departed from the town, we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. The mystery of Ardent Peak remained unsolved, its shadows still lingering in the mountains. The dark force that had claimed the town was still out there, waiting for the next chance to emerge. Our journey had shown us that some mysteries are better left undisturbed, and some places are better left abandoned. The town of Ardent Peak, with its chilling secrets and dark past, was a stark reminder of the dangers that lie hidden in the unexplored corners of the world. The vanished town in the mountains had given us a glimpse into a reality far more terrifying than we had ever imagined, and its secrets would haunt us long after we had left its eerie confines behind.